It was a windy afternoon in Washington, D.C., and the usual press conference outside the White House had begun. The media buzzed in their familiar rhythm, reporters juggling microphones, cameras snapping, interns weaving through the crowd with coffee in hand. President Donald Trump stood at the podium, exuding his usual air of confidence. But behind the flurry of noise and protocol, something far more human was unraveling quietly. At the edge of the crowd stood Clarissa Ray, 28 years old, a sharp and composed reporter known for grace under pressure. But today, she was unraveling. Her hand trembled as she gripped her mic, mascara streaking softly down her face. She wasn't even supposed to be working. Her boss had called her in despite her request for the day off, labeling this appearance as one that could define her career. Her mother, barely clinging to life after a stroke, lay in an ICU bed. Clarissa hadn't slept. As Trump concluded a remark about the economy, his gaze drifted and landed on her. He paused, stepping away from his script. The world seemed to freeze. Cameras turned. All eyes shifted. Clarissa's breath hitched. She lowered her mic, caught off guard. In that suspended moment, something shifted. The man behind the podium stepped down, walked toward her. Clarissa gave him her name. He nodded gently, told her she didn't have to speak now, but if she ever needed to, he'd listen. That unscripted encounter would echo louder than any headline planned that day. Afterward, her phone vibrated with relentless notifications. Rumors brewed. In newsrooms across the country, voices murmured about what had just unfolded. Back in the hospital, Clarissa sat beside her mother's still form, her fingers wrapped around a frail hand. Memories flickered. Her mother had always said that real stories are the ones that matter. Now, Clarissa found herself living one. Then came the call, an unfamiliar number. A calm voice on the other end identified itself. She sat upright, stunned. The voice on the line offered understanding, not questions. Clarissa hesitated, then spoke from the heart. Her mother's name was Susan Ray. There was a quiet acknowledgement, and then the line went dead. The next morning at the hospital, a nurse approached, eyes wide. The president had called the night before, requesting special care for Susan. A private room. Anything she needed. Clarissa stood still, overwhelmed. By midday, her network reached out, asking her to speak publicly. She declined. This wasn't a story to be sold. But others didn't wait. Headlines bloomed. Stories painted pictures. Clarissa, once a fierce player in the media game, no longer wanted spin, only truth. She made her choice. She would speak, but only in her voice, not the network's. Her editor hesitated, then nodded. She sat in front of the camera, not as a reporter, but as a daughter. She cleared her throat. It was time to tell a story, not one crafted for ratings, but one grounded in reality. A story that mattered. The headlines had already taken off by morning. Something deeply unexpected had unfolded, and it was resonating across the nation. Clarissa sat in front of the camera, poised but vulnerable, and began to speak, not just as a journalist, but as a daughter. Her voice carried the weight of emotion. She told them about her mother, Susan Ray, a schoolteacher who dedicated 30 years of her life to shaping young minds. Now she lay in a coma, surrounded by machines and monitors, while her daughter stood in the chaos of a White House press conference, barely holding it together. Clarissa's voice cracked as she continued. When the president noticed her tears, he didn't speak as a politician. He didn't deliver a rehearsed line. He simply acknowledged her. It was quiet, real, unfiltered. A human moment, buried in the noise of politics and protocol. Clarissa paused and looked around the room. Sometimes, it only takes one moment like that to remind us all that compassion still exists. Silence followed her words. No one dared interrupt. Something authentic had broken through. That night, Clarissa returned to her childhood home, a place filled with fading memories and familiar echoes. She was searching for her mother's medical records when she stumbled upon something she hadn't known existed, a sealed envelope marked in her mother's handwriting, "Open if I'm ever in the hospital." Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was a letter, penned carefully in ink, her mother's voice suddenly alive through the words. "Dear Clarissa," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm probably lying in a bed while you're somewhere worrying that brilliant little heart of yours. Don't lose yourself in the chaos. You were always meant to speak for others, not just report on them. Your voice is a light. Use it. And if someone kind reaches out when the world feels dark, don't shut the door. Let them surprise you. Let humanity surprise you." Clarissa wept. It was as if her mother had reached out from the silence of the ICU to anchor her again. That letter connected every piece. Maybe the story wasn't about the president. Maybe it wasn't even about the news. Maybe, just maybe, it was about seeing each other in our most human moments. The following morning brought another unexpected twist, an invitation to a private White House event. This time, not as a journalist. The envelope was simple, elegant. "For Clarissa Ray, thank you for your honesty." She stared at it, unsure whether to go. Was this an opportunity or a political ploy? The words from her mother's letter echoed again, "Let humanity surprise you." Clarissa took a breath, and accepted. When she arrived, there were no reporters, no flashing bulbs. Trump greeted her personally. His first words were simple, "No cameras today. You're not here as press. You're here because your story reminded me why I started this." Clarissa blinked, startled by the absence of performance. He continued, "You reminded me that people aren't just voters or journalists. They're daughters. Sons. Survivors. Humans." There was a gravity to his tone she hadn't expected. Inside, he led her to a quiet room where the walls were lined with handwritten letters, stories from everyday Americans, farmers, nurses, veterans, single mothers. Notes that had shaped decisions, though few ever knew. "I started collecting these again," he said softly. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot the why." He handed her a pen. Clarissa stood still, then stepped forward and wrote, "We're all one story away from being seen. Clarissa Ray." Back at the newsroom, her decision to attend the meeting stirred tension. Some colleagues applauded her courage and vulnerability. Others criticized her, accusing her of being played by politics. One voice snapped sharply, "You just humanized a man who divides people." Clarissa stood calm. "I didn't humanize him," she replied. "I acknowledged a moment that was human. That's not the same." Her boss called her into his office, his expression unreadable at first. Then he nodded. "What you did, this is bigger than any segment we've run. You've struck a nerve. People are listening. I want to give you something new. A series. Stories that matter." Clarissa hesitated for a second, and then the answer came from the same place that had guided her all week. She nodded. This was her calling. And the first story she would tell, was her own. 3 days later, Clarissa sat beside her mother's hospital bed, reading aloud the piece she had just published. It was about kindness, connection, and finding truth where few expect it. As her voice filled the room, her mother's hand twitched. Clarissa stopped. "Mom." Her mother's eyes fluttered open, then focused. Clarissa leaned in, heart pounding. Susan Ray's voice was faint, but her words clear. "Did you tell your story?" Clarissa sobbed, nodding. "You were always meant to," her mother whispered. "Nurses called it a miracle. Clarissa called it hope." That week, Clarissa's new segment aired across the country. She sat before the nation not as a polished correspondent, but as a woman transformed. Her message was simple. Politics aside, we are more connected than we think. What happened at that press conference didn't rewrite policy or shift national agendas. But it did something quieter, and perhaps more powerful. It reminded people of the simple, transformative act of being seen. Across the country, the reaction was profound. Messages poured in from nurses, firefighters, college students. People who had felt invisible now felt connected. Late-night hosts mentioned it, not for controversy, but for compassion. This moment wasn't about Trump. It wasn't about journalism. It was about humanity catching its breath and remembering how to care. Clarissa felt something stir in her. She wasn't done. She wanted to honor her mother in a way that would carry her legacy forward. So she created a scholarship, the Susan Ray Voice Award, designed for young journalists who value truth over trends, who reported not for fame but for change. Support flooded in from unexpected places. Even the White House sent a personal check, with a handwritten note, from one fighter's family to another. Clarissa sat holding it, stunned, but it wasn't the biggest surprise. That came in the form of a wrinkled envelope holding $5 and a note from a child who said they finally felt heard. That small gesture felt larger than any headline. A few days later, Clarissa returned to her hometown. She visited the old brick schoolhouse where her mother had taught generations of children. The principal welcomed her and invited her to speak at an assembly. Standing on the stage where her mother once stood, Clarissa shared her journey, not as a reporter who had gone viral, but as a daughter who had rediscovered the purpose of her profession. Truth, she said, begins when we care enough to feel, and brave enough to show it. The students clapped, some unsure, some deeply moved. Then one girl quietly stood and asked if crying in public was shameful. Clarissa gave a soft smile and said, "Sometimes, it's the bravest truth you can speak." That moment lingered long after the applause. Something began shifting. Newsrooms across the country started picking up stories they once ignored. Reporters sought out unsung heroes, janitors who protected children during storms, veterans who sat with grieving strangers, bus drivers who handed out granola bars to hungry kids. Clarissa's inbox overflowed with their stories. She made time for them, one by one. Not because they were viral, but because they were real. One afternoon, as she wrapped her segment, a staffer rushed in. "Someone's here." It was President Trump, unannounced. He entered with a calm presence and a quiet smile. "I figured you'd rather hear this in person," he said. Then he told her he was launching a new initiative, Voices of America, a platform highlighting everyday people who made quiet, powerful change. He wanted Clarissa to help lead it. She listened, unsure of what to say. But as he spoke, she no longer saw a politician. She saw someone honoring a truth that had cracked through the noise. She nodded. "Let's do it." Weeks passed. Clarissa returned often to the hospital, reading letters aloud to her recovering mother. Thousands had arrived, notes from children, strangers, even fellow journalists, thanking Susan Ray for raising a daughter who reminded the world what it meant to feel. One morning, Susan sat up slowly in bed, reading through the pile herself. She smiled, eyes misty, and whispered, "Looks like you told the world what mattered." Clarissa knelt beside her, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You told me first," she said softly. Soon after, Netflix reached out with a proposal for a documentary. Clarissa agreed, but on one condition. No dramatization. Just truth. The film, titled One Tear, One Question, One Moment, premiered to record-breaking views. But more importantly, it touched people. It opened something tender. It healed. When the time came to step back, Clarissa aired her final segment before taking a year off to write a book. Her closing words echoed with quiet power, "If you see someone crying, don't turn away." That one moment might change everything. 1 year later, Clarissa stood before a graduating class of young journalists. She read her mother's letter aloud, letting its quiet strength fill the room. Then she added, "May you always find the courage to be human first." The crowd rose to its feet. Among them stood a girl holding a hand-painted sign, "Future Reporter because of you." With funds from the scholarship, Clarissa built something lasting. A garden beside her mother's school, vibrant with color and meaning. Each plant bore a plaque with the name of a student her mother had taught. She called it Susan's Garden of Stories. It bloomed with memory. It bloomed with purpose. Years later, during a book signing, a young boy approached her. His eyes wide, a mixture of wonder and certainty. He said he wanted to tell stories, too. Clarissa smiled, handed him a pen, and told him to begin. That moment stayed with her long after the event ended. Because that tear, shed in front of a podium, had never been a breakdown. It was a beginning. It was a seed. And now, the world was in full bloom.